Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our special seminar on the issue of Diane Abbott, the weaponization of anti-Semitism and ID politics. Diane is, of course, only the latest victim of the witch hunt in and around the Labour Party. It has to be said, she's survived for quite long, much longer than many others who were perhaps a bit more outspoken in the last 8 years since Jeremy Corbyn's election to Labour leader. We should start this session off with clearly stating that, of course, neither she nor her letter is anti-Semitic, and she should not have had the whip withdrawn or any other disciplinary measures taken. Just like Corbyn, Tony Greenstein, all the other victims of the witch hunt, she should be reinstated. Natural justice dictates so that she should be reinstated. But sadly, neither the Labour Party nor capitalism give two hoots about natural justice. Perhaps she will be actually reinstated. We hear that a lot of politicians more in the center of the Labour Party, political center, have come out in support of reinstating her. And she's issued quite a groveling apology. So who knows? What concerns us more tonight is the political context of this latest scandal, which Tony Greenstein will go into tonight. We also want to take a more critical look at her letter, which did seem to downplay other forms of racism. And we might describe that as a reflection of Diane Abbott and the Labour left's identity politics. And, you know, worst case scenario of that is sort of the stating that my racism is worse than yours, if you want to be unkind about it. So we want to discuss if white people can indeed be subject to racism. Should socialists challenge ideas of race altogether? And if we reject ID politics, how should we fight back against racism and other forms of sectional oppression? So we're very pleased to have tonight Tony Greenstein and Ian Spencer. And we're starting off with Tony, who has to unfortunately leave us at about 7:15. So we're going to make this a bit of a shorter meeting, but of course there will be time for questions and comments from the floor. So without further ado, Tony, please.
Yeah, hi. I first want to share my apologies that I have to leave, unfortunately, because as people may know, I'm on furlough this week from what is now a 6-week trial for Palestine Action, and I'm literally having to compress weeks into days in order to get everything done that I haven't been able to do. So again, my apologies for having to leave. If I can share the screen, because I want to show Diane Abbott's letter, if I can bring it up. I think, yeah, okay, yeah, I think it's important that people actually see the letter. Can everyone see that now?
Could you perhaps go a bit closer, zoom in a bit?
I'm not
right click on with your mouse, right click.
I'm not sure it works.
No, if you right click, you should be able to zoom.
No, it doesn't.
Maybe not.
It's I might be able to do that's better. Is that?
That's a bit better. Yeah.
Yeah. It's control.
Even one more. That's much better. Yeah. Thank you.
Document. Yeah. And this was sent to the Observer, and it's entitled "Racism is Black and White." And that's probably quite an accurate description. She says, Tamiwa Owolade claims that Irish, Jewish, and traveller people all suffer from racism, inverted commas. They undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they are interchangeable. And then she's second paragraph. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all of their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people, and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote. And at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. So that was the letter. I think we can now zoom off it, but stop share. That's it. Yeah, okay. That was the letter that Diane Abbott sent a couple of weeks ago, which caused all the fuss and controversy, resulting in the whip being withdrawn from her. The first thing I would say is the first paragraph, which draws the difference between racism and prejudice, I think is absolutely correct. I think the second paragraph, however, is incorrect in terms of the details as she outlined them. Why is it essentially correct? Because racism is a very different phenomenon in many ways from prejudice. I mean, people can make jokes about Scottish people being mean, and there is a reason for that. It derives from the trading operations of the lowland Scots in past centuries. Likewise, Jewish people can be subject to all sorts of stereotypes and jokes. But when it comes to systematic, state-inspired racism, there is no doubt that Black and Muslim people in this society experience it, whether it's police violence, deaths in custody, and so on. Chris Carber, the latest victim of a police murder. I'm not aware of any murder of Jewish people because they're Jewish, singled out because they're Jewish. Stop and search disproportionately affects Black people. There is no offence, as far as I'm aware, of driving while Jewish, but we know that Black people of all categories, including MPs and so on, are regularly stopped by the police for no other reason than they're Black. The Windrush scandal, whereby Black citizens of this country were deported illegally to the Caribbean. Again, that doesn't affect Jewish people. So I have no doubt that it's quite correct to make that separation. I think what Stephen Andon talked about was made the same distinction between the racism that kills and the racism of ideas, of hurt, and so on. But where Diane went wrong was in the second paragraph, because she drew the distinction that only Black people can suffer racism. And that's clearly wrong, because what she in essence is saying is racism is a product not of the way that capitalism, colonialism, imperialism operates in different parts of the world, but it's a product of your skin color, your pigmentation. That simply cannot be. I mean, it's quite possible. Liberia, I think, the colony where American Black settlers came back and colonized it, Black people were guilty of racism without a doubt, and it's certainly feasible. I mean, we could have had a different world where Black people were the colonizers and white people were the colonized. So there is no inherent biological reason why racism fixes to one set of people than another. But I mean, we don't have to look to mythical or hypothetical situations. There is absolutely no doubt that Irish people at particular times, and it's arguable it isn't the case today, they are suffering from prejudice, but there's absolutely no doubt in the 19th and for parts of the 20th century, Irish people in Britain were subject to state racism. I mean, anyone who looks, for instance, at the cartoons in magazines like Punch, Irish people were portrayed as monkeys, as chimpanzees, as ghastly monsters, in exactly the same way as Black people were. So, I mean, they were seen by the British imperialists as no different from Black people. I mean, I can remember, and this is from a personal experience, when I was engaged in anti-fascist activity in Brighton. I mean, we didn't always slug it out on the streets. I mean, sometimes we did talk to them. I remember sharing a picket line, and well, not picket, it was a demonstration outside the town hall. And next to me was Steve Brady, who was a leading member of the National Front and also a member of the UDA and UVF in Ireland. And he remarked to me that as far as he was concerned, Catholics in Northern Ireland were the Blacks of Ireland, or the Blacks of Ulster. So in his eyes, and in the eyes of the fascists, Catholics occupied the same role as black people in this country. I mean, that's how the fascists saw them. There is no doubt that Jewish people have experienced state racism. I mean, obviously, not only in Germany in the Holocaust, in the East European countries where the Holocaust was perpetrated, often by the locals, not just by the Nazis. Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia in particular. Jewish people clearly experienced racism. But in this country too, the first Immigration Act was directed at Jewish people. That was the 1905 Aliens Act, which was brought in by the hero of the Zionist movement, Arthur James Balfour, who then was Prime Minister. I say, I mean, being a Zionist or pro-Zionist, he was. It was quite compatible that he didn't like Jewish people very much, but certainly supported the idea of sending them to Palestine. Again, Jewish people were subject to quasi-fascist violence and attacks at that period. The British Brothers League, which was formed in 1901, but throughout the 30s and the 40s and even parts of the 50s. I mean, I was reading very recently a book by a member of the 43 group, which was a group set up after the war to combat the resurgent union movement of Sir Oswald Mosley. And it described police beating up Jewish anti-fascists, calling them Jewish bastards and so on, in exactly the same way as they would attack black people today. So I have no doubt that Jewish people were capable of being victims. I said the Irish people because of the operation of Irish colonialism. Again, I mean, I can give another example. People will remember Lotfer Rahman, who was the mayor in Tower Hamlets. He was disqualified, ejected by the High Court in quite an outrageous display of prejudice because he exerted, or the Muslim clerics exerted, undue influence over Bengali and Muslim people in Tower Hamlets. And they used the very same act that had been used this by Irish nationalists in the 19th century, namely they were backward and primitive people. And the judge in that case, I say it was about 10 years ago, maybe less in fact, said exactly the same, that Bengali and Muslim people were not as sophisticated as the normal electorate in this country. So you see this racism which was seeping through. Lotfer Rahman, of course, of the Arise Party, has now been re-elected as mayor, defeating the New Labour previous mayor, John White. So clearly there was no undue influence. It was just that he was popular and the British establishment simply didn't like it. But there again, you see the correlation between Irish people and black people. And it's not, I mean, if you look at Diane Abbott's letter, I mean, she talks about travellers. I don't know whether travellers are white. I mean, they came from India originally, or many of them did, but there is no doubt whatsoever that travellers are subject to state racism. The Public Order Act gives police increased powers to remove travellers from their sites. I mean, there's massive harassment, the Dale Farm evictions and so on and so forth, the notices in pubs, no travellers. I mean, you still can see them in some parts of Britain. So I think she was wrong on that. And that's because, in a sense, Diane Abbott comes from a kind of a black separatist, black exceptionalist, and yes, identity politics perspective, which cannot see that racism is a product of the society we live in and the way it operates, and the Labour division, the imperialist Labour division that separates out black people, but also other people. So Diane Abbott is not a Marxist. She doesn't have any concept of colonialism and imperialism as being related to capitalism. So she sees it in terms of her identity. as a black person. I mean, to some extent, of course, that's understandable, but it also means that she also doesn't see a united anti-racist front, which encompasses other people as well. So certainly she got a lot of it wrong in her letter, but the original concept that she articulated, that is of prejudice versus racism, is absolutely correct. Now, the question, of course, is the reaction of Keir Starmer. I don't think I need to go into that too long. I mean, this is a man who declares himself a Zionist without qualification, which means really he's a racist without qualification. Not a word is said about the pogroms in Israel, the murders consistently of Palestinians in large numbers in the cities every time Israel conducts a raid. Although when it comes to Jewish British settlers who were killed a few weeks ago, 3 women, then the Keir Starmer joins the rest of the hypocritical cacophony in condemning it. I mean, condemning resistance in essence. So we should be under no illusion that for Keir Starmer, anti-Semitism is opposition to what Israel does, opposition to Zionism. It has nothing whatsoever to do with anti-Jewish racism. And so Diane Abbott was caught up unwittingly in the whole anti-Semitism crisis, because you can't speak about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. You can't discuss it without being accused of being an anti-Semitic, unless you are a Zionist and you're using it and wielding anti-Semitism as a weapon. So Diane Abbott, I say, was a victim of that false narrative. Unfortunately, and I think it is unfortunate because Diane Abbott politically is extremely weak. Instead of standing up and defending what she said and saying, yes, prejudice and racism are 2 different and separate things, she capitulated immediately and followed the Corbyn line of apologising, apologising and apologising again. Whether that will be successful, I don't know. It certainly wasn't successful for Corbyn. It may possibly be, if there is, as Tina said, this backlash against Starmer's suspension, she may be readmitted. I simply don't know. But unfortunately, the campaign group and Diane Abbott, who is a part of it, are extremely weak in standing up to the anti-Semitism narrative, which is the main ideological weapon of the Labour right in attacking the left in the Labour Party. And because they don't stand up to it, ideologically, they are defenceless. So I think, I mean, we have to support Diane Abbott unreservedly, because it's part of the witch hunt of socialists in the Labour Party, even though she herself is incapable of defending what she says. So I think that really is the context in which all of this takes place. And as I say, I mean, Diane Abbott really subscribes to a variety of identity politics, and identity politics are the negation of class politics, because what they say is, of course, your identity is the key motivating force. And because everyone has an identity, I mean, you have a multitude of clashing identities, and you have no central understanding of what it is that causes exploitation and oppression in a capitalist society. So analytically and in terms of any explanation of society, it's absolutely useless. So I'll leave it at that. I've probably gone on too long anyway, and hand over to Ian.
So you've already seen the letter, Racism is Black and White, from Diane Abbott. And of course, what we also see is her immediate retraction of that letter. I'm writing regarding my letter that was recently published in the Observer. I wish to wholly and unreservedly withdraw my remarks and dissociate myself from them. The errors arose in initial draft being sent, by whom, we don't know. There is no excuse, and I wish to apologise for any anguish caused. Racism takes many forms, and it's completely undeniable that the Jewish people have suffered its monstrous effects, as have the Irish people, travellers, and many more. So an immediate kind of grovelling apology, and one wonders whether it's a genuine reflection of sorrow, or whether it's the fact that she knows that she's going to be suspended fairly quickly because of what she's already said. So in common with Tony, I absolutely agree that Diane Abbott should be reinstated. Diane Abbott is not anti-Semitic, nor does she support or condone racism or prejudice in any form. And that, you know, although, you know, saying that she's one of the better people within the Labour Party isn't setting the bar terribly high. Nevertheless, she has had a long history of fighting against racism, even if it is from the stance of identity politics. But identity politics is pervasive throughout the Labour Party. I mean, if you recall, and beyond, I mean, if you recall, Whoopi Goldberg got into similar trouble in the United States, and the implication was that somehow, because Jewish people are not as poor as they used to be, that somehow that puts them in the position of not being oppressed. But that's part of the problem with identity politics. You end up with this kind of competition for who's the most oppressed. And from my own experience within the Labour Party, it was certainly the case that any attempt to speak on the subject of racism or anti-Semitism from a Marxist perspective was simply howled down from the point of view that because you're not black, because you're not Jewish, you can't possibly have even a view on the subject. So this is the article that she was actually referring to, and it's interesting in its own right. It's rather short. Tomiwa Owelade, an article in The Guardian on the 15th of April. And he quotes, and he starts off the article by saying he remembers hearing somebody say that white people can't possibly be the victims of racism because white people are privileged relative to black people, and therefore couldn't possibly be the victims of racism. And itself, and the article by Owelade goes on to say that he looks at evidence from the Equality National Survey, which has been published in a book called Racism and Ethnic Identity in a Time of Crisis, and it's led by a group of academics called, led by Nisa Finney, who's a group of academics from the University of Aberdeen and other institutions. But the point is, of course, that here we're looking at racism as inequalities within the proletariat. You know, we're not looking at distinctions to be drawn between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We're looking at distinctions purely between different groups within the working population. And there's this useful little chart that was published in Owelade's article, stating that more than a third of people from ethnic and religious minorities have experienced some form of racist assault. And of course, one can start to see that the people are most likely to be attacked. Of course, we don't know how scientific this is. We don't know whether some are more reported than others. We don't know whether people are more ready to attack travellers and black people, and indeed Jewish people, than, say, for example, Bangladeshis or Pakistanis. But here we have a graph that purports to show that there is considerable differences between the physical attacks upon different ethnic groups within British society. What I want to point out, though, is that class remains the fundamental determinant, even if you look at bourgeois sociology, even if you take for granted the kind of class categories of sociology as opposed to Marxism. You can start to explain some of these things. The idea that ethnic minorities are themselves inherently discriminated against is, of course, true, but some more than others. And it's also true, for example, that apart from working class boys, for example, in education, do almost as badly as people of Afro-Caribbean origin, and people of Roma heritage do even worse still. But nevertheless, working class boys do very badly. And if one looks at class, it's the biggest single. And here, I'm not even talking about it from a Marxist point of view. I'm talking about it from a purely sociological point of view. The point about sociology, as I've observed in another meeting where I talked about class and the distinction to be drawn between sociology and Marxism on class, is that sociology, as far as class is concerned, it focuses on things like status, the amount of political power that one might have, and largely drawing upon the works of Max Weber rather than Marx. And as we know, Max Weber was implacably opposed to Marxism, and the whole panoply of bourgeois sociology has grown up in opposition to Marx. Once you take out the fundamental dynamic that exists in society, where poverty is a necessary condition for the existence of wealth, and therefore class is at the heart of what determines the nature of the society, then what you're left with is a series of competing groups, and competing groups around status or whatever else. And this can be historically different at different times, of course. When I was living in East London, there was still the remnants of Jewish East London, which at one time had boasted Yiddish newspapers and Yiddish theatres and so on. But of course, most of that's gone now. So conditions change for different groups of people, but that doesn't stop Jewish people being beaten up in the street, and it doesn't stop, and it doesn't mean to say that in future Jewish people won't come under further attack. Moreover, if one wishes to try and understand why there are differentials, for example, between different ethnic groups, class is actually a better way of understanding it than individual ethnic groups. So, for example, if you want to look at differences in health outcomes for people of Indian as opposed to Pakistani heritage, it's often with relation to their class position. Indians on average tend to be a bit better off. Another interesting category, of course, is that of East African Asian. If anybody remembers the expulsion of Asians from Uganda and Kenya, people who then came to settle in Britain tended to be from a middle class within the context of Uganda and Kenya. And that's because of British colonial policy. British colonial policy existed to encourage people from India to settle in Africa, to constitute a kind of middle class within the context of the colonial administration, and sometimes take up posts within the colonial civil service. So from that point of view, they occupied a particular position. And so that therefore, when black nationalist regimes took power in Kenya and Uganda, one of the things they did was go for an Africanization policy and expel people of Asian heritage. The point I'm making here really is that even if you look at bourgeois sociology, class remains the most important defining factor. And if one ignores class, then really what you're looking at is the liberation of all humanity is pushed off into some indeterminate future. Because the typical thing is, well, you know, if you're arguing for socialism and the transition of society away from class society in its entirety, then the attitude is, well, does that mean black people have got to wait for the revolution? Well, no. As far as I'm concerned, if you're not opposed to racism, if you're not opposed to discrimination against women and any other number of groups, then you're not a socialist. Of course, we would be opposed to those things. But at the same time, one can't simply aim for formal equality within capitalism and expect that to be successful. What you'll have is groups of people are divided against one another. And certainly that's always been my experience within the context of the Labour Party. So here's Marx on the question of primitive accumulation. And again, the word primitive here is a strange one. It's not a terribly good translation of the German, I understand. So the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. And Marx here has a very clear understanding of the context of colonialization and the importance that ideology has. Here I want to draw upon the work of Eric Williams, who, before he became Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago on independence, had been a thoroughgoing Marxist scholar. And he draws upon the importance of different forms of unfree labour, as do other Marxist scholars. So unfree labour constitutes a large part of the history of humanity. And for the most part, it wasn't generally defended in terms of racial categories. Williams, for example, argues that African slaves weren't chosen because they were African. It's just that they were on the way, as it were, and they weren't the first. Indentured servants typically were among the first unfree labour in the West Indies. The part of the problem with indentured servants was, firstly, you couldn't get enough of them. It wasn't possible to send enough convicts to the colonies to populate them and provide a workforce for the cash crops. So we know that, for example, slavery, I mean, Aristotle at no point resorts to a racial category to defend slavery. And one doesn't see slavery referred to in racial terms in many other places. Sometimes you'll see references to, well, the British don't make terribly good slaves in Roman society or something. But broadly speaking, these are not racial categories. So we'd see different forms of unfree labour, whether it's debt bondage, whether it's people as indentured servants, whether they were Jacobite, taking part in Jacobite uprisings, or whether they were just simply poor people who were convicted of stealing something for less than a shilling, and instead of being hanged were sent to Barbados. And from that point of view, some of the first slaves, the first unfree labour were in the West Indies, Williams points out, were white. But they were often on a slightly different basis. They didn't take quite it wasn't quite the level of cruelty of chattel slavery, where one was literally the property of one's owner. So one would be indentured for 10 years. And if you survived 10 years, in principle, you could get home if you could afford it. In fact, lots of people just didn't survive. And of course, actually what happened is that a lot of people intermarried with black labour once it had become liberated. And even before, of course. So slavery predates racism, and white indentured labour was used widely throughout the British Empire and beyond. Chattel slavery, it was related particularly to the cash crops of cotton and sugar, and to a lesser extent tobacco, but many others as well. And it's part of that category of primitive accumulation that Marx refers to. And it's only later that a kind of pseudoscience of race. This one is slightly mischievous. This is from Harper's Weekly in the United States in the middle of the 19th century, where there is a kind of clear sort of progression drawn out between the Irish Iberian, who's, if you can't really read the text underneath, but it suggests that Africans migrated out through Spain and into Ireland. Of course, that's nonsense, and even I don't think even Harper's Weekly or the author of this was a kind of even a serious pseudoscientist, as it were. But nevertheless, as Tony has pointed out, racial categories being applied to the Irish were not unusual, and in terms of being, we see the lower forehead of the Irish Iberian, an intermediate stage between the Negro and the Anglo-Teutonic in this particular piece. So throughout the 19th century, of course, there was a growth in taxonomical categorizations of species across science. But what you then see is the pseudoscience that comes as an ideological justification for imperialism. And it applies elsewhere as well. For example, Marie Stopes, who was the great pioneer of birth control in the context of East London, was an ardent eugenicist. She wanted the working classes to stop reproducing so much because they were not fit, and the idea was there would be the pollution of the race. And one sees in social Darwinism, as I mentioned when we were talking about sociology and Marxism, the people like Spencer, for example, no relation, were arguing for somehow the preeminence of the white race in society at that time was a direct consequence of their superiority in terms of natural selection. So, of course, Diane Abbott also talks about discrimination, and of course, discrimination can be a deliberate policy, although Irish people have been described in racial terms for the most part. If one looks at sectarianism in Northern Ireland, it's got far more to do with dividing the working class. And this goes back some way. I mean, by the time you got to the 17th century siege of Derry, Londonderry, there was a recognition that there was a need to make concessions to Presbyterians within the context of Ireland at the time, unless you were part of Church of Ireland, the established church allied to the Church of England, that you were discriminated against actively. In 1848, the Queen's colleges were built so that Presbyterians could go to university, because before that you had to be in holy orders and could only go to Trinity College Dublin. So discrimination and the use of making concessions to one group of a population and others has been a state policy, and we've seen it in Northern Ireland, we've seen it in the whole of the island of Ireland before partition, and of course in South Africa that Diane makes reference to. We've seen how colonial administrations can use one group of people against another. So if you wanted to try and get a job in Northern Ireland at Short's aircraft factory, and this wasn't being, and you were Catholic, you had no hope in hell. Bernadette McCalliskey, Bernadette Devlin as was, famously said that, well, both sides discriminated, but there were more Protestants, so they did better. So if you wanted to get a job in Shorts, if you wanted to get a job in Harland and Wolff, you had to be a Protestant. If you wanted to get a job in the post office, however, then that was a place where Catholics could get a job, or the NHS. So one tended to see the kind of structuring of the labour forces as a means of dividing workers against another. And one of the things that was most terrifying for the government of the day was actually seeing the civil rights movement coming together with, at least in part, a Protestant leadership. That there were Protestants and Catholics were beginning to unite around civil rights demands, and of course inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States, where of course Jewish civil rights workers were murdered alongside blacks and buried in the same grave. So the idea that Jewish people weren't sitting at the back of the bus, well, I'm sure that's true, but they didn't stop the Ku Klux Klan killing them. The other point, of course, is that ideology can lag behind material conditions. If you walk along, there was a famous bit of graffiti on the Shankill Road, and somebody had scrawled, "No Pope here," and somebody had scrawled underneath, "Oh, lucky old Pope." And of course, the conditions in working class, and of course, in the context of Northern Ireland, the main division was between working class groups. If you walked along the Malone Road, where I had the pleasure of living for a while, you didn't see any difference. I mean, if you were hanging around the sort of leafy areas of Stranmillis or whatever, Protestants and Catholics lived together quite well. And it was a conscious effort to divide workers. So here I'll try to just draw us some distinctions between race and discrimination and point out that unless we unite as workers, we're always going to be prey. I mean, the Ulster Volunteer Force, for example, have no qualms whatsoever about talking about their identity. And so, for example, you can have your driving lessons, you can have your driving test in Ulster Scots if you want, that kind of thing. And people can divide themselves along these kind of petty lines. So workers have to unite as workers. The only way of liberating the entire population of the world is to liberate the proletariat. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, I think I want to have a bit of a chat with both Tony and Ian, and start with Tony, because you quite rightly put in the chat that some of these figures that were quoted in the article and shown on the graphic are a bit questionable. Do you want to briefly outline your objections there? You're muted.
Tony Lerman, who is acknowledged as an expert on anti-Semitism, was the founder of the Institute of Jewish Policy Research, was basically forced out because of his position by, I would call them Jewish capitalists, Stanley Carnes of Dixon and others, because he didn't subscribe to the new anti-Semitism nonsense. He didn't accept that being an anti-Zionist made you an anti-Semite. So there was a concerted campaign, led of course by the Jewish Chronicle, to remove him. But he details in the book on anti-Semitism, which is published by the Jewish Voice for Peace in America, and I've reviewed it, how it was the 1990s, he was compiling a world report on anti-Semitism, taking figures from different groups in different countries, when he was leaned on by Mossad at the behest of Dina Poret, who's the chief historian of Tel Aviv University. And Mossad had its own project fronted by Dina Poret, that it would take over the collation of statistics of anti-Semitism. Now, you might ask yourself, why should the equivalent of MI6 be interested in collating statistics of racism? I mean, MI6 wouldn't do that in this country. It's clear the reason was because Israel at that stage already was considering how best to use anti-Semitism as a means of ideological defense of what Zionism in Israel was doing. And that's why an independent expert like Tony Lerman, who had an independent academic project, was elbowed out. And eventually his own world report on anti-Semitism and his own project simply had to give way. In essence, it's a separate subject, but Israel, in many ways, has colonized Jewish communities abroad and taken over many of the institutions. We saw that with the Jewish Museum in Berlin, where the director was ousted because he tweeted sympathetically in support of BDS, for example. So I would treat the anti-Semitism statistics which come from the Community Security Trust with extreme care, because they conflate all sorts of things into those statistics. And if you drill down into their annual anti-Semitic incidents reports, you'll see often that violence against Jews, which is something you can easily collate because it comes from police statistics, is actually down, even though anti-Semitism, as they define it, is up. So I would treat with extreme caution the statistics on anti-Semitism. I actually don't believe them, to be quite honest. I mean, I don't walk around in fear of an anti-Semitic attack. I'm white. How would they even know I'm Jewish? Yeah, I mean, I really don't believe it. There are very, very few attacks on Jews. I mean, there are some, but they are really rare compared to Black and Muslim people. So, I mean, you know, someone who flicks my hair, that's a violent attack, but someone who gets stabbed is also a violent attack. I mean, these really are not comparable.
And of course, there are, you know, if you look in today's society, there's no doubt Black people, because they are visually, you know, Black will get the vast majority of racism. There's no question about that. But as we said, you know, historically, Diane Abbott was wrong. And the statistics on the travelers was interesting, though, because I don't believe they're making that same, you know, self-declaration. There was quite a lot of racist attacks against travelers, and that's certainly government backed. And they are, of course, white people. Can we look into this?
But they are distinguishable. People know who are travelers because of where they live, what they do, and so on. And Jewish people were physically distinguishable in Poland and so on in Europe. I mean, I mean, because of the inbreeding amongst Jewish people and not having intermarriage, so they did develop physical characteristics facially, and you could recognize someone who was Jewish. Yeah. So,
and it reflects, of course, the needs of capital and class society more generally, that at different times you turn on different groups of people that you need to criticize, divide and rule, etc. And that was interesting, Ian's introduction in terms of, you know, racism. Well, slavery at the beginning was not necessarily based on racism, and that is, we looked at this issue before, that actually sort of pre-class society didn't really have slavery because they didn't know what to do with slaves. They were living on the land, moving along, etc. When class society comes along,
Robin Blackburn in The Overthrow of Colonial Slavery, which is an extremely useful and important book, makes the point that slavery is not one single phenomena.
Indeed.
Slavery in South America was latifundist. The slaves, I don't say they had a good time, but they were able to regenerate and have their own societies. And the same with slavery in the ancient world. It was not the industrial slavery that Black people experienced, which was genocidal. I really do think, and that's the same with indentured labor, that what happened in the Caribbean was mass murder. Literally, the white plantation owners decided it was cheaper to replace the labor than to keep them into their old age. And that is a very different thing. Slavery is not just one form.
Yeah, but we need to locate that particular slavery within the rise of capitalism. It was absolutely necessary to locate that different form of slavery, indeed, and there was
colonialism,
indeed. But the idea of race and racism, I mean, that is not undisputed either. And, if you have children, as I have now, and that they don't understand racism when they're small, they have to be taught that, the color of the skin is somehow important. They have no concept of it at all. And there are studies, if you want to divide people into races, you'll find huge genetic differences within, a particular group that you pack together as these are Black, and there's a huge genetic difference within that. How useful are those terms of race and then racism even?
Well, race is an artificial political construct. It's not, it's not scientific. We know that, the Nazis had extreme difficulty in defining Jews racially. So they had to go back to past practice of the religion. We know in South Africa, you had honorary whites because it was convenient, the Japanese were, and so on and so forth. So race itself is an artificial construct, but racism is a very real and concrete thing. And that's what people, because sometimes you get, well, Jews aren't a race, therefore I can't be racist, but you don't have to have a race to be racist. Racism is simply about discrimination on the basis of any arbitrary category in terms of class society, to be quite honest. And it can be on any basis, religion, so-called race, color of eyes, even if you want. It doesn't matter what the character is, or nationality, national background. Yeah, but this was an artificial science, which rationalized colonialism and imperialism. And Ian's got into the eugenicism, this false science that believed you could inherit certain characteristics, and by controlling birth control, you could eliminate it, or through euthanasia, as the Nazis did. And they borrowed that from the United States. Incidentally, Hitler looked to America's record on eugenics and praised it to the skies, because they were doing much the same thing. So, eugenics was the false science that gave birth to Nazism.
Ian. I'm not disagreeing with any of that. The first point, Tony made a point about indentured servants. The condition of indentured servants was much better than that of chattel slaves in the West Indies. But William's point, which I think is important, is that the Africans weren't chosen because they were Black. They were just there in sufficiently large numbers. There was already a long existing slave trade in Africa long before the development of cash crops like sugar and cotton, which is why I included a 17th century picture of a North African slave market. They were simply there in sufficiently large numbers, and were able to withstand the conditions. The first people to be enslaved, and Marx refers to it in his work on that little piece in Primitive Accumulation, was the Aboriginal people. So the original Caribbean people were the first people to be enslaved, but many of them were simply wiped out by Western diseases, and subsequently indentured servants were used, but they simply couldn't get enough of them to do it. But anyway,
there was a debate about enslaving white people. There was a definite political decision taken that would not happen. There was a revulsion against the idea of white people being the property of other white people.
And of course, in the ancient world, there was no racial.
No, I'm talking about in Britain.
No, I understand there as well.
Yeah.
Okay, can we turn to the question of ID politics then, because I think that's slightly complex, perhaps, and I've had a lot of criticism for criticizing Diane Abbott of identity politics. Lots of lefties think that she's not guilty of that. She's just a Black activist of the left, of the Labour left. How do we define ID politics? I think with feminism, it's quite easy or quite simple. And Sylvia Pankhurst took a stand against her mother and sister, the suffragettes, because they were fighting, for women, bourgeois women, basically. They disregarded the question of class. And they said, bourgeois women need the vote, and we are basically, we don't really have much in common with working class women. We are part of the bourgeoisie, etc. And she criticized that, Sylvia Pankhurst, and made a point about, you have to support working class women. How do we, what do we criticize about Diane Abbott's stance on, she's not a Black sectionalist as such, is she? Tony, maybe.
Oh, right. Okay. Identity politics are the negation of class politics in a sense, because you see society divided into different identities. And the problem is the oppressor also has an identity. So you get this competition. So, you had in the early, after the Lebanese invasion, when Spare Rib, if you remember Spare Rib, the magazine of the women's liberation movement, it had articles by women against Palestine. There was a fierce reaction by Zionist feminists. It said, our Jewish identity is being attacked by support for the Palestinians. And that's how we identify. So they were identifying with Israel. And you could have the same in South Africa, that white women would also have an identity, but it was the identity of the oppressor, not the oppressed. Billionaires have an identity if it comes to that. Maybe we should outlaw hostility to the rich, because they too suffer, no doubt, from the taunts that people like us make. So no, it's understandable that the oppressed will adopt an identity like Black power, for example, because of their very oppression. They see it in that way, but unfortunately it doesn't provide a route out of their oppression in terms of an alliance. So yes, we must oppose. The reason we oppose racism is because it divides the working class. And like in Ireland, you can't ignore the oppression of Catholics, for example, because deriving from partition as it does, that means a division of the working class. The problem with groups like Militant is that they ignored those divisions and pretended you could just have an artificial unity, which of course broke down every time the national question was raised. So we do have to deal with those issues. And that means confronting white workers over racism. And where you do that and you break it down, as has been done in the working class in Britain, then you have a much stronger unity. Yeah, but if you ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist, then sooner or later it will come back to bite you.
And sectionalism as well is another.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Ian, did you want to say something?
No,
No, okay. We've got somebody who would like to ask a question. I think the experience, a lot of people have really good memories of Ken Livingstone as, the sort of fighter for anti-racism, and he did a good job, etc. But he also perhaps, and that might be controversial, led to this idea, we are of different communities, multiracialism, they have the divided up into different sections, all applying for funding from the GLA to do their own thing, a springing up of different caucuses and different groups that divided themselves off from the rest of the left, from the rest of the working class, to get funding via his GLA, which is not entirely unproblematic, I believe. Don't know if either of you disagrees with that or has a particular viewpoint on that.
Well, I think, I relate to the GLC, which is probably before your time, the Greater London Council. And the things that Livingstone introduced and the left did, because they ousted the right in what was a brilliant coup in a sense, did bring, gay liberation, but also anti-racism to the fore. It funded Black groups, but they engaged in anti-racist work. they gave funds to the Jewish Socialist Group's project, much to the ire of the Board of Deputies. And that is really the origins of their antagonism to Livingston. So it had a very radical content. It wasn't, the money didn't go particularly to, if you like, identity groups, which also fulfilled the role of oppressors. I mean, yes, radical feminist groups got grants and so on, but I think overall, it brought the issue of racism into local government, anti-racism, in a way that had never been done before. That's why Thatcher abolished it. You know, I mean, they were also a base for the miners operating in London, let us not forget. So, I mean, it was a very overall a very positive experience. And Livingston did stick his neck out, even if he's a Starmer supporter today.
Weirdly, yes. Okay, John, I think you don't want to come in, but you can speak now or ask a question. We can hear you.
Right, thank you very much, Tina. Mine are really comments rather than questions as stuff. I mean, thank you very much to Tony in particular for actually saying that racism is a construct, and that has to underpin everything in terms of our understanding of it. Where I disagree with Tony is on the difference between prejudice and racism. I think that the way I've always conceived the two is that prejudice is located in the individual, whereas racism is located in the state and in state and other institutions. I say other institutions because I'd include the Orange Lodge in that. I visit Glasgow often, and the Orange Lodge is very active there, and of course in Northern Ireland as well. I would back up the idea that that it's not just Black people who can suffer racism, by referring to the racism which I've seen by Pakistani groups in this country against Mirpuri groups, which reflects the discrimination, the institutionalized discrimination of the Pakistani state against Mirpuris and other Kashmiris in the 60s and the 70s. It was the building of a big dam on Mirpuri land, which caused the migration of a lot of Mirpuris to this country. Then you get the role of ex-slaves after the Civil War in America in putting down the indigenous Native Americans. You've heard the Bob Marley song, Buffalo Soldier. There was quite a lot of that actually going on. You've also got the complete imperialism of Bantus in Africa in the 16th and 17th century against other African groups. Both of those sides, if you like, are Black. You've got the Indians' views of Muslims has been mentioned. And I think that raises the issue of how do we rank Islamophobia in relation, or how do we relate Islamophobia to racism, which I think needs to be sorted out. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Comrade. Well, that's, yes, we have touched on it, but hierarchies of racism. I mean, you know, obviously we had one made up one in the Labour Party, which seemed to, you know, ignore all forms of racism, just put anti-Semitism at the top. But, you know, is there a point of course, it wasn't, of course, but they created this, of course, but that seemed to be everything else was ignored, only anti-Semitism, made up anti-Semitism, false accusations of anti-Semitism. But should we turn it around and say, you know, no, this is the real hierarchy of racism, and, you know, it's got Black and Islamophobia, and, you know, should we get into that?
I hate the term hierarchy of racism, because I think you have to look at each example of racism in its own terms. And it's not a question of comparing. So that's why I disagree with John about prejudice. I mean, yes, I mean, I can be subject to prejudice, but it doesn't originate from the state. I'm not in fear of deportation. I'm not in fear of police violence or any of the other things. I might be persecuted because of my politics, but not because I'm Jewish. And that's very different. I mean, I wasn't subject to a control order under New Labour, which, you know, without trial, I would be imprisoned in my own home. All of those things. I mean, so Islamophobia was, although I don't like the term because it isn't really hatred of the Islamic religion, but anti-Muslim racism, it is a very real phenomenon. And of course, John's correct. The victims of racism could also be the perpetrators, even at one and the same time. So the Irish in the United States were victims of racism, but they also participated in the extermination of native Indians. So, I mean, yes, I mean, there are many, many contradictions. And can I just say one thing, going back to what Ian was quoting? I mean, Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, is very interesting, but there are substantial critiques of his economism and his explanation for why Britain abolished the slave trade and then slavery. I just add that it was one of my pet subjects when I did an MA in colonial history.
We've got Steve Freeman who wants to come in. Hi.
There we go. I managed to do that. Yeah. Okay. I want to just trace a little bit back to the distinction between republicanism and there's Tony's shocked and horror, but he'll be slightly surprised if he manages to survive what I've got to say. And economism, because of course the economists have always said and always argued in the movement that you can ignore oppression. But republicanism argues or claims that the state is the oppressor of the people. And therefore we have to trace oppression to a political factor of domination, as we said in the Roman version, domination, dominus and servus, if you like, which is why, Tony, you'll be right to talk about Mossad or the Akhrana or the role that the state plays in these particular things, because it's a political phenomenon. Now, of course, the state says we're not pushing oppression. It's the ignorance of the masses. You know, anti-Semitism in Russia was caused by the ignorance of the masses. No, it was the state that was behind that. It was a part of oppression, political oppression by the state. And that oppression, of course, can take the form of prejudice, it can take the form of discrimination, it can take the form of violence, it can take the form of murder, mass murder, genocide. They're all different forms of this political oppression. And it can therefore affect, as a generality, women, LGBT, religious, ethnic groups, trans, and class oppression as well. So in a sense, these are all different forms of oppression and to which the state, it seems to me, is at the centre of. And of course, it differs in different times and in different places. So if you're in Afghanistan or Iran at the moment, it's absolutely clear that a form of state oppression is very much to do with women's oppression, etc. A different time, a different history, it might be a different place. So the fight against the many forms of oppression is universal, and it is a fight for democracy. Essentially, that's what the fight is about. And it's a fight of uniting the people in the struggle for democracy. Now, of course, what materialism does is it places state oppression on the basis of property relations and traces its root back to ownership, control of property and class exploitation. So these political oppressions, which the ruling class uses the state to enforce, obviously have their root in class society and have their root in economics, but it's political oppression and the role of the state as a dominant force in society. And so therefore, that's why we can generalize from it and not get locked into this type of oppression or that type of oppression, and understand its unevenness throughout that society.
And that logically, of course, racism, the state being racist, doesn't actually make that much sense, because capitalism is colorblind, really. It wants to exploit people for as much, you know, many hours it can a day, for as little, paying as little money as it can. And I mean, I do struggle sometimes with the idea that, you know, the border controls, we have to get rid of racist border controls. And are they really racist though? Are they, you know, can rich Black people not get into the country? Of course they can. It is anti-working class border controls. They are anti-poor border controls rather than racist border controls.
Oh, I disagree on that. I think I really disagree on that. I think there is a racial division of labor. Of course, Black people will always, if they're rich, and there's not that many of them relatively, they can evade it, of course. But immigration controls fall primarily on Black people. I mean, the Windrush scandal did not occur to white people. The whole virginity tests, if you remember them going back some years now, and Wadita and so on, they were directed at Muslim people. I have no doubt that immigration control is inherently racist in this society, because we colonized the country to Black people and brown people. We didn't colonize white countries. So in that context, yes, they are racist.
That's the issue though, isn't it? That there aren't white Windrush people, you know, there weren't any, they weren't asked in white people. So, you know.
They didn't have to be. I mean, but they didn't remove citizenship from any section of white people in this society. They did it for people who had been here for over half a century. That wouldn't have happened to Jewish people here.